And I will move us straight to our next session, panel session, which we've titled Rooted Again, How Media and Culture Can Reconnect Us with Our Environment. It was Cristina Figueres in her forewords to our 2020 The Superpower of Media report who argued that climate change is not a scientific or a political problem, it's a cultural one, and I think the session just now with Matt talking about how comedy can help us links to that as well. We're increasingly disconnected from nature, although of course we are nature. That includes because of urbanization, the rise of technology, loss of outdoor activity in daily life, cultural shifts from seeing nature as our essential life support system to something we can exploit and profit from. And so much of what we need actually eventually comes from nature, the roofs over our head, the clothes on our back, the food on our table. But once we consume it, it's often completely disconnected from its natural state. So we'll try to explore how media can reconnect us with nature and hopefully drive friendlier lifestyles for nature and for climate. And I would like to invite my panel up to join me on this. So we will have Lucy Siegle, who's a writer, broadcaster, and public speaker on ecological issues and sustainability. She's a reporter on The One Show and speaks and writes on environmental issues on Sky News, Good Morning Britain, from Marie Claire at The Guardian, amongst other publications. Thanks, Lucy. One of these three. And we will have Sam Sutaria, who is CEO of WaterBear Network, which is a B Corp certified social action platform giving people the tools to do good, and also an impact-led storytelling studio. Previously, Sam was general manager of the European Nature Trust and trained with the BBC Natural History Unit. He's a passionate conservationist and photographer. Give it up for Sam. And then last, but certainly not least, we will be joined by Daze Aghaji, who is an environmentalist and cultural strategist. She's the co-founder of Absurd Intelligence, a narrative agency, and she brought climate activism into the famous house, i.e. ITV Big Brother, in 2024. She works to bridge the gap between the art and the environment. Thank you, Daze. Great, so to start us off, question to each of you and all of you. You are all doing what you do and in your fields because of a passion for nature. Where does that come from? What drives that for you? Maybe Lucy first, I'll go in that order. My grandfather actually worked for Shell Oil in a refinery in the northwest of England, but he was really into ecology, he was really into bird watching, and he bought me a bird book when I was 8. And I just got really into nature, essentially, even though I lived in a very suburban and urban environment. And that's where it stemmed from for me. And my granddad used to, even though he worked for Shell in the refinery, he used, as lots of people did in that area, he used to not use plastic bags in the 1970s, 1980s. And he used to carry these awful string bags to the supermarket, and I was really, really embarrassed. But something must have stayed with me. So when I was grown up and I found myself working in media, and originally I just answered the phone and I worked in the mailroom, I just couldn't understand why nobody was talking about nature. I was a young person then, so of my generation, and that's where it came from. It just felt very natural for me to have conversations, because many of my friends were, but when I got into a media space, they weren't. So that's what happened to me.
Okay, thanks, Lucy. How about you, Sam?
I always tend to answer this question. It sounds a bit like a therapy session, which I strongly encourage to everyone. But my parents divorced when I was very young. No, but they did, and I bounced a lot between the two families. And my mum travelled the world and lived from South Africa through to Wales, through to Cornwall. And I used to go and see her on the weekends, and the classic story of spending a bit of time in nature as a kid. But it must have rubbed off on me, and actually ended up studying natural sciences and just became obsessed with the natural world. But it was really a trip to Madagascar when I figured out that the science that was happening was so important, but a bit to the last conversation we just had, the science wasn't getting out there and wasn't being translated through story. And I picked up a camera, and there was an ex-army photographer who was on this trip. And I just bugged him for weeks to teach me how to take photos, and it became a passion, which then led to paying for beer money through university, and then led to figuring out how I could get involved in this thing called rewilding, which I did for most of my 20s, and worked very much at the intersection of story and rewilding and conservation throughout the UK and Europe, and then ended up trying to pioneer more rewilding projects in many countries, from Scotland to Romania to Italy and beyond, working with large carnivores and, replanting old growth forests. But all this time trying to figure out how can we get more people involved with this movement and tell those stories. And that's really what led to WaterBear. But yeah, nature has been the kind of consistent thread throughout my life. I think I found a lot of solace in it as a child. And now, it's really the backbone of everything we do at WaterBear, which I'll talk a little bit about in a second.
Great, thanks, Sam. How about you, Daze?
Yeah, similarly therapeutic. I grew up in quite a dysfunctional family dynamic. My father was an alcoholic, and I grew up in severe poverty in Tottenham. And yeah, so I kind of went through my childhood feeling quite unsafe in many different ways. And then my mum, she ended up having a dream, quite literally, like a mystical dream that started her restaurant, which is another story for another day, but it is a very good story. But when she started her restaurant, she ended up sending us to boarding school because she was a single mum and she didn't want us basically to figure out how to become adults in the middle of Tottenham in the early 2010s. So I went to boarding school, and it was the first time that I felt safe ever, and it was in nature. There was a little kind of marshlands behind my boarding house, and we would sneak out at 11 o'clock after bedtime when we thought the alarms, just before they would turn on, we'd sneak out and spend loads of time out there. And then I just fell in love, and it was this relationship part of it, of where I knew that nature could take care of me, so I felt this intrinsic need to take care of her too. And I started seeing nature as more than just, scenery, but a living, breathing thing that deserves respect and great appreciation. So that was the beginnings of my relationship with nature. And then I moved back to London when I was about 16. And then I got very sick, which ended up having to being connected to air pollution, because I lived really close to an incinerator, which I'd never known my whole life. And I just started developing health issues. And that's how I found out about the climate crisis, because it was through Googling and trying to figure out what was going on in my own body. I found out that there is this massive calling of us to be better people. And it was, and also it was really hurtful, because I just fallen in love with the natural world, and then you find out that it's under threat. And as she protected me, I wanted to protect her, and that led the beginning of my activism.
Oh, that's an amazing story, and it's just reminding me of all the research that we have that nature has, just spending a couple minutes of your day in nature has this huge sort of health benefit and healing effect. And that kind of leads me to my second question. Why do you think our increasing disconnection from nature, which I talked a bit about in my introduction, is an issue for us? Maybe I can start with you, Daze.
Yeah, I think, to be honest, I always see the lens, the lens that I kind of look into the environmental crisis through is around belonging and this culture of disconnect. You can kind of trace back, especially in the UK, trace back the beginnings of this to, the social writing of Descartes, where he started to talk about the separation between humans and nature. And then you see it play out in the enclosures in order to, aid and abet capitalism and this industrial growth. And you see that this disconnection was the root trauma that plays itself out in many different iterations in slightly different ways, people who talk about colonialism, people who talk about, capitalism and exploitation. It's all the same problem, but it goes back to this larger disconnect. And I feel that's kind of what we see in the modern world today, of where, it's quite funny, sometimes I think about it in a really purely, almost rational way, children see it, of how could we be living in a time of where we're told that the only thing that sustains our life is at risk, and we choose not to do anything. It sounds quite mad, but it only exists because of this disconnection. So connecting in a time now is extremely radical, but it's not just about connecting to the natural world, but it's about connecting back to ourselves and what does it mean to be human, and what does it mean to be human in this particular time and moment. And I am a slightly woo-woo-y, so I do believe that everyone has been given their role, and it's about how do we find our role in this time. Yeah, there's no coincidence in my head that we happen to be the people who are working in comms at this moment of need.
I'm not. Oh, sorry.
Yeah, go ahead.
No, I'm not sure if anyone's been to Romania. Maybe show of hands. Anyone been to Romania?
Yeah.
I spent a lot of time in Romania in my 20s, and wrote about it and photographed it and cycled across it many times, and thought a lot about this idea of shifting baselines, which many of you might have heard of, and this idea that people who are born today, what is the norm for them? They accept because that's what they've grown up within. But actually, if you think through what our previous generations experienced, their norm was entirely different, and they would be used to a wilder, more diverse natural environment. And the reason I mention Romania is because it feels a little bit like that when you step back into those old-growth forests in Europe. It's the largest expanse of contiguous old-growth forest in Europe, and there's wolves and bears and lynx and all these amazing creatures, and it does feel a little bit like stepping back in time. But I think this idea that we are born into this kind of our own version of normal is what's creating this big disconnect from actually what it should be or what it once was. And I think that's really, again, how we will bridge that connection. And the topic of today is how you use media and storytelling to paint a picture of something that could be, or we could step into, or imagine a future that should exist. And I think, 2 points. One, go to Romania and go check it out. And there's plenty of other amazing places, but we were massively into this idea of slow tourism, and to some of the points that were made earlier, how do we travel a little bit more softly and step a bit more gently through these amazing spaces, and that was incredible. And secondly, I think the technological advancements that we're obviously experiencing, and I understand the paradox of what I'm doing, which is building hopefully a highly addictive digital platform to connect people with nature. It feels kind of strange, and we're wrestling a lot with that, and we'll talk a little bit about it, but it's how do we design our platforms in a totally different way. And that's really the work we're doing at WaterBear, is to try and figure out a way to prioritize and promote healthy engagement and purposeful engagement, as opposed to just clickbait and algorithms. So I think it's a real melting pot of ideas, but the thing that always stuck with me was, one, my trip to Romania and this idea of a shifting baseline.
Excellent. Anything to add from you, Lucy?
Well, I think it's really interesting, because sometimes it's also known as sliding baseline, which gives you a sense of how quickly you can kind of lose it, and how quickly, you think one generation you feel disconnected, and then how more disconnected the next generation will be. I think what's striking is the way you're both describing universal themes, and it's very profound. And I think I come from a different generation, and there just wasn't the capacity, interest. If I'd have even gone to my editor when I was, working in the mailroom and said, hey, I really want to talk about these universal themes of how we're becoming disconnected from nature, I think I would have been locked in a cupboard, even at The Guardian. It would have been like, she's really crazy.
Even at The Guardian.
Even at The Guardian. So what I did was I tried to find a different way of making the connection, I think. And I did that through supply chain, which sounds really like supply chain. But I've probably spent 20 years really telling people, the fashion industry, it's a full spectrum industry. Do you know where the materials come from? They come from the cotton fields. They come from oil, from cracking oil in Venezuela in a refinery again. And I was so sort of keyed into that sort of supply chain mentality, factory mentality. And actually it's funny, because when we were kids, there was a children's TV show that everybody watched on network TV, and they would show you, go through a different shaped window, and you would see a supply chain in a factory. So I think we are products of our era culturally, and I think that's how I interpreted or tried to connect people to nature. I've just probably gone a very long way around it, and then I basically did different supply chains. So I talk about food, I talk about energy, and eventually I got to fashion, which is where I stayed, which I think we'll talk about a little bit later on. Because if you're in the fashion industry, you're in the farming industry, you're in the waste industry, you're in the recycling industry, but that's not the ones that anyone wants to talk about.
Yeah, that's interesting. And you're just talking a bit about how 20 years ago, talking about these things, you would have been locked in a cupboard. But, I think where we are today, we're still very often trying to sort of sneak these messages in, aren't we? We're trying to get them in. Yeah. Get them in by stealth. So maybe we won't be locked in a cupboard, but we've got to sort of be sneaky about it. We can't.
It's a metaphorical cupboard.
Yeah.
Yeah, we're still locked in a metaphorical
maybe
cupboard.
We still are, yeah.
I think so. I mean, if I work in TV and broadcast as well, and if I have one more meeting with a commissioning editor who said, we've got to get this in by stealth, why? Like, why? I mean, some of the stuff Matt was saying, it's pretty inarguable. Who are you trying not to offend by, slipping in messages by stealth? But then also the reality of the situation is that we're in, what do we call it, an attention economy. So no one's obliged to watch someone banging on about climate change. So, you know, maybe making it entertaining has become the new stealth almost, and then actually now there's a move, isn't it? Make it more populist, beat them at their own game, which I think there are some issues with that, which maybe we'll come back to. But yeah, it's still, we're still not being entirely who we are and who we want to be necessarily. Well, maybe Daze, you are, because, you know, you,
I'm the annoying person who actually did go and try.
You did it.
Try and fit it into a popular format.
Yeah, but you just went in there and you just did it, and that was, you know, probably one of the most brazen displays of environmentalism that I've ever seen on one of the biggest reality formats in the world. So, kudos to you, because that's pretty cool.
Thank you.
I mean, maybe we can talk about that a bit more next, because yeah, Daze, you took that argument into sort of into the Big Brother house, and you had some pretty heated debates with, well, I guess you could call the other side, people who don't sort of believe that climate change is something we need to be doing something about. Yeah, I guess, could you tell us a bit more about that experience and how you found that?
Yeah, so it was quite funny. So we were writing up something about talking to that kind of 70% middle ground that Matt was talking about earlier. And I captioned it, speaking to the ITV audience, as I was writing this report. And then I got like this mysterious, almost like godlike DM in my Instagram that was like, we're looking to cast someone for Big Brother. Are you interested? I know, and I was like, oh, wow, this is quite timely, right? So I did actually end up going through the process, and I thought it was really important because, one, Big Brother is like such an OG reality TV show that talks about this social experiment, talks about having to like find a way to get along and trying to find a shared truth that can allow you to exist in the same house with people who are fundamentally very different from you. So I thought that was interesting in that respect of actually having to almost make the argument to people who are so different. And then also, personally, in having to, you know, leave the great Republic of Hackney that I think most environmentalists in London live within, to have to kind of check myself as well and see where is the nation at in, you know, this kind of like smaller place that's been engineered to have very different people. So it was quite a tough experience, if I'm totally honest. Going into the house and realising that, because I remember one of my most iconic moments was speaking to someone who was very much a proud reformist, Nigel Farage voter, and I told him he upset my feelings, and he told me to F off, and I didn't know what to do with that, because I haven't been confronted with culturally, like, such difference like that, so I started crying. So it was like moments like that was quite interesting. But I guess from the climate point of view, I think a large part of me being there, which I didn't know at the time, was to bring light to the existence of climate activists being quite normal people. Yeah. I think that was the thing that ultimately came out the most. And I had lots of feedback through email and through my DMs about a lot of people having seen me and would have never thought that that was the vision of a climate activist. And then also the understanding and letting everyone unpick what does it feel like to kind of go into that? Because I didn't come from an environmentally like savvy family. My mum didn't know about the climate crisis till I was already in it, and she thought I joined a cult. So, you know, I hadn't had that upbringing of like loving the environment and knowing that there's a problem and people around me trying to do something about it. So having to open up about why I went into this career that kind of chose me, but I didn't choose it, was really interesting. But then also meeting people who still live in like the world of where Shein is like a totally normal thing to buy from, and it's bought, and then like going on these massive hauls and trying to find middle ground with them. So yeah, it was a really interesting moment in time for me, of where I learned not just a lot about where the public is at and how to be a better communicator, but also learned a lot about myself and how I can kind of like bring this level of softness and gentleness to an issue that feels so overwhelming. You know, and the fact that environmental activists aren't perfect. I still eat meat. I still do a lot of things that aren't great for the environment, but also I try to give myself grace as well, and I try to kind of see that as like a thing that we should all do.
You did it really well.
Thank you.
I actually went to a Edinburgh TV festival this year, and there was a session on Big Brother which I went to because a friend of mine was in Big Brother last year.
No way.
Yeah. And she was on a panel. And your name came up a lot, and this was the people, the architects of it, the producers from the first series, and they were so thankful for what you brought. It was a really big moment for them, actually.
Yeah, I was the first climate activist. I was the first activist, which I was really quite surprised by.
Yeah.
But also, I think this is also a thing, because, like, one, I came in with the implicit want to talk about democracy and climate as much as possible. But then also, there is this kind of level of the people who are actually the people who create the storyline. You know, where does the responsibility truly lie? Because I can be myself in some way, but there's a lot of things that I talked about in the house that never made it today, you know, about that kind of softness. I was very much, like, casted as, like, the slightly fiery character who's always ready for an argument about politics. But then, like, there were certain sides of it of where, you know, I talked about my love for nature and the natural world and, like, those kind of softer things that didn't make the edit. So it's also a question of that, of, like, I can play my role as a character. However, there's also the other side of the responsibility of the producers and the storytellers in that format to kind of think, how can I make sure that we're having these conversations in a useful way?
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, and I mean, one sort of scene that I really liked was, and it sort of goes back to the humanizing point that Matt made around how comedy can sort of humanize you and disarm you, was where you sort of said, oh, you know, it takes quite a lot to glue yourself to a building, or like you're not just doing that for fun. Like, you've got to be pretty desperate.
I was like, you're not just. No one wakes up in the morning to go to the M25 wearing a nappy just because they want to. Yeah, and I think that point really hit home for a lot of people, because I think people see it as people just being annoying rather than people being desperate at the fact that a lot of these activists have been doing this for decades. Yeah. You know, I'm quite early to the game in comparison to the people who I've glued myself next to or been next to in protest. They are desperate, and they're seeing the ticking time bomb of what we're facing, the kind of, like, scales of fuckery. I love that one, because that's so true. It's such a good way of saying it. They're seeing it, and they're seeing us getting closer and closer to it, and they are unsure what to do next, you know. And I also find it quite funny in some ways, and this is a conversation that we had that did make its round around Twitter, was about how whenever we talk about the changes that we're so grateful for having, that have been gotten by protests, we always forget how those protests were not just annoying, but in some cases actually extremely more radical than what we see today. Like, everyone loves the suffragettes till they find out about the methods, you know, and I think there is something about, like, if that's what we're doing for women's rights, what should we be doing for all life on earth? You know, and if you're having the inconvenience of being blocked in a road, that is the bare minimum to some of the effects of the climate crisis that I have personally witnessed that people are living through right now, because it is not future generations. It's not even really it's generations before. A couple of years ago, I sued the government over carbon emissions, and that's a very long story, but we might talk about it later. But my co-claimant, Peter, he lived in Skipsea in Yorkshire, and he was watching the coastal erosion eat his back garden to the point of where he knew he would lose his house. He couldn't retire because he knew that he would need money for when that house ends up in the sea, and he didn't know what he would do for him and his wife, Sheila. This is happening right now. That's happening 5 years ago. So if that are the stories that are coming out of the UK in this moment of crisis, it's something that we need to see as immediate.
Yeah, absolutely, and that goes back to something Matt said as well. And one other question I wanted to ask was, so you were talking about sort of the audience in the Big Brother house and how you were sort of cast as the climate activist, and you were having that argument, but I guess there was maybe a broader strategic play by ITV to sort of also thinking about how we can reach across this sort of our echo chambers in society. You know, typical Big Brother watchers might also not be sort of people who fully understand the climate crisis and what we need to do about it. So I guess my question is, how can sort of unscripted reality TV and maybe other sort of less traditional formats be used to sort of get that message to the people that need to hear it most, i.e. not preaching to the converted? A question to all of you, really.
Yeah, I mean, I think maybe there's been a lot of progress in that, you know. There's designated, you know, TV professionals being exposed to sort of climate facts. And the thing I always say, especially about TV for some reason, is the level of talent and the way that ideas can incubate within TV. Like, I work predominantly in factual entertainment. Is really astonishing. Like, it was something that I'd never seen in newspapers. It was much more of a meritocracy. Like, you'd have these morning meetings, and somebody's could be the first day as a runner, and they had an idea for a story, because it's so hungry for ideas. And it will be, if it was a good idea, it'd be like, yeah, take it up, like strike off whatever was on the board. And, that's the way it works. And then you've got people, we had a props department and they used to make like incredible things. Like one time they made an animatronic penguin in an afternoon. And I was like, how does this happen? And I was like, if every climate story had an animatronic penguin and a group of people who can make stuff, like they were straight out of art school, and then you'd get somebody who was brilliant at graphics. And I was like, we could do anything with this. And that's why it's so frustrating, like the trickle of stories. Because I think TV is uniquely placed in terms of talent and execution to get away really great ideas. But just back to what you say really quickly, I think Love Island is an interesting one because, just from a fashion textiles point of view, the first few series were basically bankrolled by fast fashion, ultra fast fashion. And then you had some pushback to the board. And then you also had a character, a real person, Brett Staniland, who went in, who's had a PhD in something to do with sustainability, and refused to wear any of the hideous, like, placky outfits that he'd been given, and just wouldn't play ball at all. They edited him really badly out of spite, but a year later, eBay was sponsoring. So, I always think the Brett effect was huge, and that was a whole seismic shift. The fast fashion companies still go crazy in the ad breaks, and they're still like relentlessly pursuing the viewing audience throughout the series, but they lost that purchase, they lost that real estate, and that's really, really important. So well done to ITV for that.
Coming to your question, I think we know who people listen to, right? Trust in governments, trust in media is struggling, and I know there's lots of media professionals in this room working to affect that positively, and I sincerely applaud you to it. But we know people listen to their friends, and we know people listen to their family and their community and the people and trusted, people within their frame of reference and within their spheres. And I think that's really what we've tried to adopt as a strategy to bring more people into this movement and to break out of this echo chamber that we live in. And I think the collaboration that we try to create digitally through a storytelling frame, but to actually really ultimately build partnerships is how we approach our campaigning and our community building. So we, I guess, figured out from the early data of our platform that people were really wanting to connect with other like-minded individuals. Again, this is all pretty basic stuff that we know, but it's how do you get that at scale in an ecosystem that rewards trust and safety and builds a non-toxic experience for people to actually engage with their friends and with, the truth in many ways. And, people like people who are, connected to them and share their values. And of course, we want to try and bring new values and ideas into that space as well, which is where the interesting storytelling comes in. But that's critical, I think. And secondly, it's the partnerships that we build. And Daze will talk to this a little bit as well in terms of how do we link to culture and experiences and festivals and music and all this fun that can be brought back into this space. And like Matt said earlier, comedy is a perfect example of this. How can we bring a bit of laughter and humor back into what we're doing? But we have now, over the last few years, built hundreds of partnerships, bringing the worlds of NGOs, brands, civil society, media, broadcast, production companies, studios, creatives, all together into kind of one ecosystem to try and create that melting pot of ideas. And, to Lucy's point, I think that's where, those great ideas come from that will get out there and into the mainstream.
And somebody has to, break the mold, don't they? I mean, it's kind of amazing when I hear about what you've done at WaterBear, but like somebody has to say, right, I'm going to change this. We're going to make it different. We're going to make it more collaborative. I mean, I interviewed Gail Galley recently, who's from an advertising background, and she's just started. She's a serial founder of things. Like she did Goals House, and she's just done this thing called the Nat Ball in New York, which is like the Met Ball, but for nature and climate. And she was telling me about her early days at Radio 1, and when she started there, it was like weird old men in bomber jackets and tracksuits doing all the road shows. They were the voice of youth, and she just went there and she was like, "What is this?" She got rid of them. She had Radio 1 in Ibiza. She went to did the Glastonbury collaboration. But it took her to go and say, sorry guys, this is actually crazy, because media works on formats, because we've been doing the churn, legacy media certainly. We need 10 top tips for the back page every week, you know, blah, blah, blah. And it's only when you get people in going, why are we doing it like this? That everyone's like, oh, I don't know, really. I just inherited it. So sometimes you just got to break it. I mean, really.
Yeah, and I think we've tried a bunch of things over the years, some of which have worked, some of which haven't. But, we used to put an RFP out to our network of hundreds, if not thousands, of independent filmmakers and creative studios. And just the kind of collective think tank brain power of that space and kind of flipping the more traditional development model on its head of saying, let's kind of crowdsource ideas and intel. And, we couldn't get all of them away, and some things worked, and we flopped hard on others because we just loved this idea but couldn't get it made or couldn't find a partner to come on board to get it done. But it was just this amazing, powerful kind of surge of, collective will from this network that we've built around the world of all these different ideas and creatives that was so powerful. And just finally, the creator space, and I use creator as a very broad catch-all term, and to narrow it down, the environmental creator space, which again is a broad catch-all term for filmmakers, journalists, writers, artists, storytellers. We are inundated right now with questions and fear, because we just got back from Climate Week, a few of us are there, people are being shadow blocked like there's no tomorrow over there, right? And they're just for speaking the truth. And again, to Matt's point, it's like people are getting out there and trying to say these things, but there are systems at play now that is making our work and our life and our industry insanely difficult. And there is, I guess, the light within that is that there is a camaraderie between everyone saying, okay, what do we do about this? How do we find new platforms, new paradigms, new distribution? Because we all know there is a distribution crisis for this type of storytelling. And I just thought I'd share that because we have been overwhelmed by the shared problems that this community is facing, right? The platforms, the paradigms, the distribution, the lack of funding, the lack of support, the lack of creative mentorship, the lack of training, the lack of all these things, all of which this room is trying to positively impact, which I applaud you for. And it's been heartening in many ways to be in rooms where, people like this are coming together and thinking, okay, how can we actually rebuild systems from the ground up, build new platforms and paradigms, and if we can play our small part of WaterBear, brilliant, and that's not really the point I'm making. It's more as a society, as a community. It's really scary on the one hand, but I think the response has been, somewhat encouraging.
The lack of funding is
terrifying.
Hideous. It is really hideous.
Yeah, and I think that's why it's even more important that we're kind of like hijacking the mainstream. Yeah. I think it's really important to be like, how do we seed these stories in places that they're not just trying to be like, this is environmental storytelling, and it's like contextualized in a different way. And especially, exactly. It's like we kind of need to abolish that in some ways. So at Absurd Intelligence, which kind of functions like a slightly bastardized think tank. I think that's the only way to truly describe it. One of the projects that we have is called Hard Art, where we work with, I think now our membership is about 500, 600 different artists all across the world in many different ways that they would call themselves artists. Whether it's the academics who are thinking of the bold, brave, and thought-leading ideas, whether it's visual artists like Jeremy Deller, Cornelia Parker, whether it's musicians like Brian Eno, who's one of the founders, and trying to find a space for us to co-learn together and be influenced by what's going on in culture that we really need to take a part of, and then seeing how it lands with everyone, and also having loads of bad ideas, loads of ideas that never actually leave the room. Also having loads of ideas that are really good ideas, but we're not the ones to do it, so we give them away. And they're trying to find a new way to work collaboratively and creatively in a time of where it does feel like the arts in some ways is under threat.
I love that term, hijack the mainstream, and that sort of brings me to a question I wanted to ask you, Lucy, because I know we spoke about that when we met previously.
I'm not representing the mainstream.
No, but I was thinking about the point.
She's undercover.
That,
She's undercover.
We often have one sort of environmental plant, like, we had Daze in Big Brother, often this one character that sort of has all the burden. And maybe that's no longer really reflecting the reality, where it isn't. It's sort of a minority. We know it's not a minority of UK society that's worried about climate change. Actually, it's a majority. And do we need to move away from that one character sort of being the environmentalist in the room and to integrating it more into sort of every character, in a story?
Yeah, definitely, because when it's tokenistic, it's not reflective of people's concerns, is it? And I've played that role a lot. TV presenting is essentially just doing a series of characters. That's why I always find Steve Coogan's Alan Partridge so excruciating to watch. You've got campaigner Alan, you've got celebrity interviewer. It's all these different roles. And, I was the green queen, they used to call me sometimes. But it was so interchangeable, and it can be taken off you, and you can be given something else. Like, I remember once going into work, and I've been doing green stories because that's what I do. And they were like, oh, your surname, Siegle, rhymes with regal, and we're doing a thing at Buckingham Palace, so could you be the royal correspondent? And I literally, on live TV, had to fill for 7 minutes because the Queen was late, and I was talking, utter bollocks, because I don't know anything about the royal family, I don't have any interest, and I didn't know what I was talking about. And it's like, how did I get into this? So the point is that what I try to do is to try and be sort of aggressively collaborative, even though my job is not particularly collaborative. You're expected to show up, read the words off the script that's been written often by committee, and the first thing I will do is talk to the contributors, see how they want to be represented, and then I get a lot of people contacting me who are like, oh, I really want to be on your show, I want to do your slot, and I'm like, well, you're probably not going to get it because I do it, and I've been doing it for a long time. So why don't you do it with me? Or let's go to this thing together, or whatever, because that's my form of radical action in a very, very non-radical environment.
Just to jump in on the radical collaboration piece, and this was, I guess, part of the founding DNA of what we do. But just to kind of shout out to everyone trying to operate in that way, it's bloody hard, right? And it's like everyone goes collaboration and community and all these things. It's like if you're trying to be an impact-led studio that's trying to get stuff away on TV and you're trying to bring impact producers into it and work with local crews and not flying, all these things that we all try to do every day, it's really tough, to actually make ends meet and, even eke a tiny margin out there to kind of pay your team and keep it going. And, it's something we've debated internally for a long time because we have to be collaborative, and this kind of idea of creative collaboration, I think, is super powerful, but it is insanely tough to make it work. And I think, again, just a huge shout out to everyone trying to do that, because we're there with you, and it's tough as hell.
I will say one thing for the show that I've worked on for a long time, which is called The One Show. It's on BBC One. They're fantastic about community.
I was kidding.
You haven't heard of it?
No, I was kidding.
Well, lots of young people haven't. So. But they are really good about community, because commissioning editors are always like, no one's interested in community, or there's this kind of folklore around TV. And my show is, it's all they care about really is what communities in the UK. And that's where you get quite an honest response. Yeah. So you might think, we had Matt was talking before about, that dilemma, should you go and talk to you're a green scammer, the whole kind of Reform UK rhetoric. And in the wild, you don't encounter it very much because it's so amplified. It's so amplified, ironically, by the media, but it, it's not to say it's not there, and some people don't hold those views, but as you alluded to, most people want some action, especially around flooding and food and farming,
that's the thing when you make it about, not just a climate story, but a story about jobs or a story about housing and shelter or migration or all these things.
And I think that there's this I feel like we've missed the mark on the recognition that everybody, including the Farage, actually probably more so the Farage voting public, is recognising something isn't quite working. Yeah. And if we see, I grew up partly when I went to boarding school. I was in Skegness in Boston, which, if anyone knows about the area, was like safe hold seat. It's one of the reform seats currently, and it has been like that for a long time. At the time where I was there, it was the second highest place in the UK to vote for Brexit. So it's like they're actually somewhat on the beat that something isn't quite right. So when I would talk to people in there, I actually, when I came back to London, I think this was like 2018, I did like a conversation piece in this town about some of the issues around immigration, etc. And it was really interesting because they would recognise that there's something wrong, but they've already been given a solution that was easy enough to regurgitate. But there was not that much of this kind of conversation of is there other possible solutions that we can look into? And I think the climate crisis, I've always seen it as it's the final frontier of all the other issues that have been plaguing society for a very long time. And if we make it so that the climate crisis and addressing that can be a way that we can address all the issues that people are fundamentally feeling right now, It's a game changer, and that's how I talk to the Farage voting public, because it's like, oh, they don't care about the climate, that's great, but could we create some sort of offshore wind energy that can give everyone back their jobs? And they will be more than happy to participate in the green revolution if they get their jobs and they feel like they can earn a decent living and they feel like they can take care of their family. You know, and maybe the climate doesn't actually have to be that much of an important message in that.
Well, there is some. I mean, there's, for example, there is a project. There's a company that's set up at Grangemouth, which has been the seat of a lot of loss of jobs from oil and gas, which is pretty much staffed by people who used to work in oil and gas. And renewables, of course, are not just energy, but all of the ingredients in supply chain and raw ingredients and stuff like that, which have all shifted to renewables for cosmetics, food, you know, lots of different supply chains. I've never heard that story told, but actually, even when you are creating new jobs in the green economy, the pushback is unbelievable. And I remember talking to somebody once in the first Trump presidency who had opened a big solar facility in the Rust Belt in the US, and them just saying how shocked they were when they went to do this massive opening about the pushback. No one was interested because the rhetoric had been so strong against it, and it wasn't the jobs that they wanted. They wanted the old jobs back. So we should never underestimate quite how much damage that rhetoric can do. And it's not always as simple as presenting, you know, a new green. It won't be treated. It won't be treated with parity, is what I'm trying to say.
But I think it's largely because a lot of the time when we talk about solutions, especially from like a policy level, communities hardly ever actually brought along on the same journey. So it's one thing to go, okay, we need this, and these are the things that we need to produce in order to create a green economy, and then now this is your job to do it, rather than going, we're going on a journey of where we're trying to figure out how to save our Earth and how to make sure that we have all the things that are fundamentally human, and that we all know that we need and we all know that we want. You know, and I think this is where the act of conversation and finding new ways for a lot of my work at the moment is really focusing on this, like, how do we get people to actively participate better in democracy? Because when people feel like they are on the journey, that, you know, I think someone, I can't remember who told me this, but they basically went, there's a reason why people keep their IKEA furniture. It's because when they buy furniture from IKEA, they make it, and then because they've made it, they feel like a certain reverence towards it. And I think that's the kind of like interestingness of how do we build the world that we want to live in. We have to have people feel like they're participating in it, not just being told this is what we need to do.
And I guess that's maybe the challenge for the media companies in this room, is how do we tell that story of, you know, linking some of the problems that we see today around food prices, which Matt mentioned, or housing and risks to housing, to climate change, but then also how do we engage, you know, all the way from the sort of national level down to the local level, bring people along. We could probably keep going for another 2 hours, but I think I'm going to stop us there and see if we have a couple of questions from the room. We've probably only got time for 2 or 3 before we go for a quick coffee break. And again, I will remind our online audience who are being very quiet, I'm wondering if you're there, I hope you are, to also submit questions through the Q&A function. But yeah, any questions from the room? Gentleman at the front here.
Thank you so much, everyone. I'm going to dare to utter his name at the risk of controversy, and he's far from a perfect man, but Jeremy Clarkson has perhaps done more to advance the climate conversation in the UK than many other people out there. For what it's worth for me, I think Clarkson's Farm is probably one of the very best television shows that has ever been made, and I'm not the man's biggest fan. But one of the things that really strikes me about that show is it's not a show about climate at all. Climate just inevitably features throughout. And when you see someone like Jeremy Clarkson taking a full episode to rewild a part of his farm, that gives me, to go back to the earlier conversation, hope, because someone who drove around in cars for all that time can do it. He's made these issues accessible to millions. I think season 3 debuted to sort of 5 million people in the UK. That's the most watched show on Amazon, in the UK at least, for some time. But that wasn't a show about climate, it was a show about farming. What are some of the other sort of topics that you think we can take to introduce people to the climate and environment conversation without saying, there's a climate disaster, there's an environment disaster, now watch this show? Because I think that's where we're at risk of losing our audience, because people are tired and they have such limited capacity for bad news. So we need to find alternative ways to introduce those messages. What are those other forums that we can use?
Yeah, I'm in actually quite a bit of agreement. I think Clarkson's Farm, it's an amazing program because it does show it. There's like really amazing collaborators as well who are kind of like activists, like Andy Keto, formerly Groove Armada, currently Wild Farm, you know, that talks about how like going from a Ketty DJ, he went to being a regenerative farmer and how that saved his mental health and also made him feel like he can participate in this like larger environmental conversation. So I think it's also a genius piece of media. And I think that the easiest way to connect it to is trying to find things that are something that people face every day. Like, for example, fashion is a really big one. I think people connecting to clothes and crafts, especially in the UK, where we are seeing this real long for nostalgia and real long for heritage, to kind of tap into those kind of like conversations about, you know, what was it like to live on this Isles in a time of where William Morris was one of the great thought leaders and talked about this idea of creating with labour, having things with purpose and beauty, and connecting to that heritage, but also having this like, who are the new fashion designers who are like taking on that. I think there's something about at the moment of where people, and you know, it's kind of talking to like the fear thing of where people are kind of having stark reactions to the new. Yeah. How do we base it in something that feels like familiar, but then also invites people to kind of look a bit further afield into what it could look like now? So I think fashion, but something that's focusing mostly on crafts as well, and it's something that everyone can do. Like when I tell you, try to make a T-shirt at home, and then you'll never feel like it's the right thing to do to buy a £5 T-shirt from Primark, because it's really hard. And people should be paid better for their labour. And it's like even just doing that, you kind of have this moment of going, oh, I need to think differently about how I consume without it being so obvious and being told to consume less.
I agree with you on Clarkson's Farm, and I was actually randomly watching the last episode of the Grand Tour the other day, and he literally, on, I don't know, the final scene when they're getting emotional, he's basically bashing electric cars and saying, I'm never doing another series of this because it's all going to be about electric cars. To then go on the next series on is you know, as you say, has a big climate message within it. We're doing a lot of work in food at the moment, and we've actually just shot a pilot for a TV show called Dinner is Scrapped, which brings celebrity guests together and is looking at kind of how a top chef can guide people through a cooking competition format to actually use scraps is probably slightly underselling it, but like, you know, things you wouldn't expect, and everything has a kind of climate message weaved in, and our chief content officer often says, you know, vegetables within the pasta kind of strategy, as we've talked about today. So I think food's got a hell of a lot to give. We just got back from Climate Week, and, you know, food is a huge topic of conversation. You know, there's a big event going on this weekend in Stockholm, you know, with the EAT Foundation, and I think there's just a lot of rich opportunity for storytelling. It's culturally relevant. It's, you know, touches everyone 3 times a day, and I think there's a huge opportunity there for lots of food type storytelling with the vegetables and the pasta, not to completely exhaust the metaphor.
Fashion and food. Any other ones to add, Lucy?
I would like to respond to your question or your statement. I think awareness and familiarity and enjoyment, unfortunately, don't equal impact. Clarkson's brilliant at what he does. His teams he works with are brilliant. He was brilliant on Top Gear. He'll be brilliant on Farm. He'll be brilliant on whatever he does next. And it's not rocket science in a sense. That's a very well-known way of making television that we are very good at in the UK. You get really good, charismatic people. You know, they're really articulate. You put them in certain scenarios. You film them really well. All of the ingredients that I mentioned before. What we do know is that it's great that people enjoy those shows, and, you know, enjoyment and entertainment is a big part of it. But we do know that in terms of shifting the dial on climate action, climate and nature action, you need to get on the news. You need to get a news program. So it's where people still get most of their information from, actually. It's probably starting to level out a bit. And we know even in newspaper formats, if you take legacy media, the lifestyle pages, which where I applied my trade mainly, although I did do op-eds as well, do not get as much attention, impact, and really have no bearing on policymakers at all. So we really do still need to address the massive deficit about coverage in news media, because that is the direct mirror of politics, and that's where we're going slightly awry. But, God, I'd love to work on a show that's as popular as that, yeah. You've got some nice fashion ideas. Maybe we can work something up.
Last question before we go to a coffee break from our online audience. Thank you. So can we think of an example? Maybe I can just get each of you to give me one example, a short answer, of how we can achieve social tipping points, and are we doing enough at those places? That person already mentions festivals, music, sporting events. Any other events where we can capture a big audience?
Well, at the moment, to be honest, my methodology for the past probably 5-6 years has been like, try and throw as many options to the wolves and see what sticks. And I do think with our time pressures, it's that, like, you know, our absurd intelligence, we have like a larger think tank function that's a bit more policy-led, that's doing stuff with Chatham House. Then you have like an entertainment arm that's doing stuff with artists. Then we actually do have a speakers agency as well in-house that's pushing stories into, you know, media. So it's like, how do we try to do as much stuff like that? I think is quite interesting. Also, I think digital space as well for younger audiences, because I know most of my friends get all their news off TikTok, which is like awful, but it's where society in that generation is at. And the younger generation, because I'm Gen Z, the young generation, Gen Alpha, is probably getting all of their media on TikTok. So there is something about how do we kind of bring those kind of like lifestyle influencers who are kind of having that conversation about themselves. And I think it kind of speaks back to one of the things that I wanted to mention to answer the question before, but I saw this amazing movie called The End, and it's on Movie, which is like this very cool and shiny and kind of like Vice-styled editorial film platform. And it was called The End, and I ended up meeting the director, Joseph Oppenheimer, who went from documentary to fiction. And he made a whole 3-hour film that was about the climate crisis, never mentioning the climate crisis, never marketed as a film about the climate crisis, but actually just following the story of people's lives. And it starred like Tilda Swinton and a bunch of other really amazing actors and actresses. And there was something about it that I thought was really interesting, because it didn't really talk about climate, didn't talk about politics, didn't talk about all the stuff that everyone wants to avoid. But it kind of spoke to, like, how do you live with the actions that you don't take? And that's something that I feel like everybody, whether it's the boyfriend that you should have stayed with, or like, you know, or the thing that you should have bought, it's something that everyone can relate to. But it set it in the climate crisis, of where it's like, it was about a billionaire family who'd already gone underground and left the world to burn. And it was about them basically going around never actually talking about what they had done or what they had not done, and how do they live with themselves. And I think that is a really interesting angle to go in on that storytelling. It's storytelling about consciousness, about what can we be okay with not doing. You know, and that's like, that really makes people feel like uncomfortable in a visceral way, but a useful way.
Can we emphasize short answers?
Sorry.
Because we need to go to coffee break.
Okay, I'll keep it short. To answer the question, we did an amazing partnership last year with Glastonbury, which, again, just opened my eyes and our eyes to the power of partnership, to the power of music. You mentioned Brian Eno and Sounds Right and Earth Percent, and all the guys that are doing amazing things to bring nature to the forefront as the artist that she is. But I think, to be as brief as possible, partnerships like that, we had so many music lovers. Some could look at us straight in the eye, some were a bit cross-eyed, coming up to us and just engaging with our space full of seaweed and stories and, you know, yoga and sound baths, and it was just this amazing moment of humanity coming together. And I think those big cultural moments can create the tipping point.
Well, we already have sort of some revolutionary things that have happened. We name storms now, and that's really, really significant, because behind the scenes, that's to do with attribution science and the rising credibility of attribution science, and the fact that climate is a settled science. So that might seem like a really small thing, but let's keep giving things names, because that seems to cut through.
Great. Okay, I'm going to end it there. Thank you very much for joining us. Thank you very much for your questions. We will now go for a break until 3:30, according to the slide, according to my agenda, until 3:15. Grab a coffee, and then we'll let you know when you need to come back. Thank you very much.
There's a difference in opinion.